When the United States entered World War I in April 1917, the American armed forces faced an unprecedented challenge. Despite the nation's industrial might and vast resources, the U.S. military was woefully unprepared for modern mechanized warfare. While the Navy boasted powerful capital ships, the Army's ground forces lacked essential equipment that had defined the Western Front's brutal stalemate. The one critical gap that threatened American operational effectiveness was long-range heavy artillery specifically, the kind of super-heavy guns that could strike deep into German territory and disrupt their carefully maintained supply lines stretching across occupied France. The Western Front had become a grinding war of logistics and attrition. Every day, German forces maintained an intricate network of railway lines connecting their front-line positions to rear areas. These rails were the lifeblood of the German war effort, carrying troops, ammunition, food, medical supplies, and all the material necessary to sustain millions of men locked in brutal combat. The Germans, learning harsh lessons from the first years of the war, had fortified their railway infrastructure with extraordinary care. The most critical link, the main line running from Metz through Montmedy to Sedan, had become what captured German documents called the most important artery of the Army of the West. By 1917, the Allies had attempted to solve this problem through various means, but they faced a persistent disadvantage in long-range artillery. The British, defending their sector against German bombardment, deployed 12-inch guns of pre-dreadnought vintage. These weapons, designed for naval combat decades earlier, were now positioned in fixed installations or on unreliable mountings. The Germans, by contrast, had built magnificent emplacements featuring 15-inch naval guns salvaged from incomplete battleships of the Bayern and Brandon classes. The situation was clear. The Allies needed something dramatically more powerful and more mobile. What they needed was an American solution born from American industrial genius and American naval superiority in ship construction, the vision of Admiral Ralph Earl. In the spring of 1917, as American troops began arriving in France in ever-increasing numbers, the Chief of Naval Operations faced a peculiar opportunity. The United States Navy possessed an abundance of one thing that the Army desperately needed: massive naval guns. The 14-inch 50-caliber gun, fresh from the successful construction programs of the Navy's capital ships, represented the state-of-the-art in long-range heavy weaponry. These magnificent cannons had been manufactured in quantity to arm the New Mexico and Tennessee-class battleships, and the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance, under the leadership of Rear Admiral Ralph Earl, possessed extensive supplies of spare barrels, ammunition, and all the technical expertise necessary to maintain and operate them. Admiral Earl conceived a revolutionary idea. Why not mount these naval guns on railway cars? The concept was not entirely new. Both the British and Germans had experimented with railway-mounted heavy artillery. But the Americans would do it differently, more completely, and with a level of sophistication that transformed a desperate measure into a technological triumph. The vision was not merely to mount a gun on a train, but to create a complete, self-contained mobile battery capable of arriving at a firing position, digging itself in, and launching devastating strikes at targets dozens of miles away, all without requiring external support. In early summer 1917, Admiral Earle presented his recommendation to the Chief of Naval Operations: construct 5 complete railway batteries, each featuring one 14-inch gun, supported by a train of specialized cars containing everything necessary for independent operations. The concept was approved on November 26, 1917, and authorization was given to construct the mounts. But time was a factor. The Great War was consuming resources at an unprecedented rate, and the Germans were launching desperate offensives in France. The Americans needed these guns as rapidly as possible. Design and engineering, the impossible task. The challenge facing America's industrial might was daunting. The designers at the Naval Gun Factory had to create a railway mount capable of handling a gun weighing hundreds of tons, capable of elevating to extreme angles to achieve the necessary range, yet confined by the French railway infrastructure's dimensional and weight limitations. The gun carriage would need to operate on French railways with their distinctive narrow gauge and limited bridge capacity. The entire system, when loaded, could not exceed the weight limits that French railway authorities had established for their network, a constraint that would prove both frustrating and ultimately innovative. The specifications were challenging. The 14-inch 50 caliber gun itself weighed approximately 77 tons without its massive breech block and counterbalance systems. The new elevation mechanism had to be specifically designed for railway operation, unlike the barbette-mounted systems designed for battleships. The gun would need to fire at angles up to 43 degrees of elevation, giving it a maximum range of 42,000 yards, nearly 24 miles. When firing at such extreme angles, the gun required a specially prepared foundation pit between the railway tracks to absorb the tremendous recoil forces. At lower elevation angles, less than 15 degrees, the gun could fire directly from the rails, with the hydraulic recoil system and the railway tracks themselves absorbing the recoil. The manufacturing contracts were awarded in February 1918. The Baldwin Locomotive Works, one of America's premier manufacturers of locomotives and heavy machinery, received the contract for the gun carriages and locomotives. The Standard Steel Car Company, another industrial powerhouse, was assigned to construct the 72 support cars needed for the 5 batteries and the command train. The time frame was impossibly ambitious. Both companies were ordered to deliver completed equipment within 100 to 120 days. By conventional standards, the task was impossible. By the standards of wartime American industrial mobilization, it was barely achievable. The race against time, an industrial miracle. Samuel M. Vauquelin, the visionary chairman of Baldwin Locomotive Works and a member of the War Industries Board, took personal charge of the project. What had seemed impossible became a testament to American engineering and manufacturing prowess. The American Bridge Company, contracted to build the girders and structural components, performed work at such rapid speed that girders arrived at Baldwin's Eddystone, Pennsylvania shops ahead of schedule. Baldwin's shop superintendents fully prepared for rapid assembly, had already gathered trucks, air compressors, winches, castings, and other specialized components. The first gun mounting was completed on April 25, 1918, just over 2 months from the contract award. By early May, the first gun car was ready for testing at the Baldwin facilities. The tests were rigorous. The gun was tested at low elevation angles, up to 15 degrees, while parked on the rails, demonstrating that it could handle its enormous recoil without external support under these conditions. Tests at 25 and 45 degrees of elevation required the digging of pits between the tracks, providing the foundation necessary for absorbing the gun's tremendous recoil forces at these extreme angles. By midsummer 1918, 5 complete railway batteries had been assembled and prepared for shipment. Each battery consisted of the locomotive, the massive gun car, 2 specialized ammunition cars, one for shells, one for propellant charges, 2 kitchen cars, one for crew, one for officers, a headquarters car, 3 berthing cars for crew quarters, a fuel car to run generators and power equipment, a workshop car, 2 specialized equipment cars loaded with tools, cranes, and construction materials, and a supply car for sand and timber needed to prepare firing positions. The command train, which would coordinate operations among the 5-gun batteries, consisted of 9 specialized cars, including headquarters, radio facilities, communication equipment, spare part storage, and additional facilities for the command staff under Rear Admiral Charles P. Plunkett, then a captain, who had requested the assignment, believing it offered the best chance for him to see combat action more directly than would be possible commanding ships. Personnel and preparation. The assembly of personnel for this unprecedented mission required extraordinary effort. Initially, the project was classified as secret, a classification that proved impossible to maintain when thousands of workers descended on Baldwin's facilities, when the Pennsylvania Railroad had to move massive components, and when rumors spread through naval circles about a mysterious new weapon being built. Once the veil of secrecy shattered, an unexpected problem emerged, overwhelming enthusiasm. According to contemporary reports, at least 20,000 officers and men requested assignment to the naval railway batteries. The vision of sailing across the Atlantic, operating a massive naval gun in combat, and potentially achieving personal glory in the trenches of France proved irresistible to naval personnel accustomed to the routine monotony of ships in port or distant convoys. Captain Charles P. Plunkett, the commanding officer, had to personally select and train approximately 500 men and 30 officers to crew the batteries. These were not conventional sailors. They were trained naval gunners who understood the intricacies of heavy artillery operations, fire control systems, ballistics calculations, and the coordination necessary for effective long-range naval bombardment. The transatlantic journey. In May and June 1918, the personnel began their transatlantic crossing. 2 ships sailed from the Philadelphia Navy Yard, one departing in late May and another in mid-June, carrying the crews who would operate the batteries. The guns and equipment followed on separate vessels, carefully dismantled into components that could fit aboard transport ships. The USS Newport News, originally the German freighter Odenwald seized in American ports when the United States entered the war, made the first arrival with equipment components on July 8th. The freighters Bath and Pensacola followed with additional components arriving July 4th and July 27th, respectively. Additional material arrived on the Malang and Rappahannock in August. The disassembly and reassembly process was a feat of coordination and technical expertise. Someone, in a bureaucratic oversight that would have been comical had it not caused delays, had left all the detailed assembly instructions back in the United States. The crews, faced with the equivalent of a giant IKEA furniture set but without the instruction manual, had to rely on personal notes taken by a few men who had witnessed the original inspection and proof firing trials months earlier. That they succeeded assembling these complex mechanical systems correctly, using only personal notes and practical knowledge, speaks volumes about the quality of the naval personnel selected for this mission. Arrival at the front. The Woozlefinch takes shape. The first complete train was declared ready to depart St. Nazaire on August 11, 1918. 2 additional batteries followed on August 18th and 19th. The trains began their journey across the French railway network toward the front lines. The first battery, designated Battery Number 1, was briefly diverted to the French proving ground at Meuse Argonne for evaluation and proof firing. The French artillery officers, astonished by the gun's accuracy and performance, were so impressed that they immediately demanded the battery's deployment to active sectors. In a testament to the gun's capabilities, when Battery Number 1 fired 8 rounds at Nucemont, all rounds landed so close together that the French refused to permit additional ammunition expenditure for testing purposes. Battery Number 2, commanded by Lieutenant Junior Grade Duckett, was sent directly to the forest of Compiègne and immediately placed into action against German railway installations. By September 11th, Battery Number 1 had completed its testing and was dispatched to combat operations near Soissons, where it would conduct bombardment of the Laon railway yards. Batteries 3, 4, and 5 arrived at the front lines during the final week of September, deployed near Verdun to support the newly committed American Army in the operations that would lead to the Meuse Argonne offensive. The nickname Woozlefinch, a deliberately nonsensical term that has baffled historians ever since, became the affectionate designation for the Railway Artillery Reserve coordinating the battery's operations. The term appeared on insignia patches worn by naval personnel and Army liaisons coordinating the battery's movements and fire missions. Its origin remains mysterious, but it perfectly captured the improvised, creative, and somewhat whimsical nature of American innovation during the Great War. Tactical organization and command structure. The 5-gun batteries were organized with remarkable efficiency despite their complex operations. Captain Plunkett, commanding the entire battery organization, exercised overall strategic control. Individual batteries were commanded by junior officers. Lieutenant Martin commanded Battery 1, Lieutenant Smith commanded Battery 3, Lieutenant Hayden commanded Battery 4, and Lieutenant Rogers commanded Battery 5. Battery 2, which saw the most intensive action, was under the command of Lieutenant Junior Grade Duckett. The batteries operated in two general groupings. Batteries 1 and 2 primarily supported French forces defending and attacking the western sector of the front, particularly around the Oise, Aisne, and Laon regions. Batteries 3, 4, and 5 concentrated on operations against the critical rail lines feeding the German army around Verdun, specifically targeting the Metz-Montmedy-Sedan railway line that constituted the Germans' main lateral communication artery, the art of long-range bombardment. Operating these weapons required an entirely new approach to artillery fire control. Naval gunners understood how to calculate ballistics and fire at distant targets, but the railway batteries introduced elements of operation unique in warfare. The initial range was obtained from extraordinarily accurate French war maps based on Lambert projections, with coordinates marked in kilometer squares. Given the coordinates of a target and the position of the gun, fire control officers could calculate exact range and direction through simple dead reckoning calculations. The typical firing procedure, as described in post-war technical reports, began when battery commanders received new target assignments. First, they determined whether the new target could be reached from the gun's current position. If not, the gun remained in place and a new position was selected. A new firing pit was prepared if required, often built specifically for the operation. Once the gun was positioned, supporting equipment cars were placed a quarter to a full mile behind the firing position, carefully camouflaged against enemy aircraft observation. Battery commanders then established aiming points prominent landscape features or artificially placed markers for calculation and communication purposes. Telephonic communication was established with the nearest artillery command post and with meteorological observation stations, Sundage stations, that transmitted weather data every half hour in radio code, including precise altitude above sea level, wind velocity, and direction at various altitudes, and barometric readings. The innovation of aerial fire control. The most innovative aspect of the railway battery's operation was the integration of aircraft for fire spotting and correction. When conditions permitted, an airplane arrived to serve as aerial observer. This aircraft, carrying a pilot and an artillery officer trained in spotting techniques, would observe the fall of shells and transmit corrections back to the battery. Since the aircraft could transmit but not receive radio messages, the battery crew prepared signal panels, 4 white sheets of canvas, 1 measuring 9 by 9 meters and 3 measuring 9 by 3 meters, laid on open ground visible from the air. When ready to fire, the aircraft would cross enemy lines to verify target visibility. If the target was visible, it would return toward the gun position until the signal panels came into view. If all was ready, the battery crew would spread the large panel, and the aircraft would radio, "Are you ready to fire?" The battery commander would respond by having one of the smaller panels spread at an agreed angle next to the larger sheet. The aircraft would then position itself above the target and transmit the fire command. The gun would fire 3 rounds in quick succession, The aircraft observer would estimate corrections for all 3 shots together, not individually, transmitting messages such as so many meters to the right or left, so many meters over or short. The battery commander would apply these corrections to his firing maps, convert the distances to yards. All American calculations used yards rather than meters, and adjust the gun's aim. While the aircraft returned from the first 3-round salvo, this correction would be applied and the gun loaded for the next series of shots. However, aerial spotting was not always available. Low clouds, fog, mist, or radio interference frequently prevented aircraft observation. In practice, approximately 90% of all shots were made using maps and gunnery tables alone, with occasional corrections from ground-based forward observers positioned on the front lines. Operational challenges and German response. The guns did not operate unopposed. The Germans quickly recognized the threat posed by these long-range weapons and launched multiple countermeasures. German artillery units, despite being closer to the front and thus limited in range, attempted counter-battery fire against the American positions. More significantly, the Germans directed repeated air attacks against the battery positions, including aggressive strafing runs by fighter aircraft. The Germans also intensified artillery bombardment of the areas surrounding the gun positions, attempting to kill the supporting crews, if not the guns themselves. The designers had foreseen these threats. Both the gun car and ammunition cars were heavily armored with protective plating designed to withstand standard artillery fire and bomb fragments. This armor proved invaluable, as numerous near misses resulted in splinters and earth being hurled against the protected positions, causing casualties among unarmored support troops, but leaving the guns and their immediate crews unharmed. 5 men from the gun crews themselves were wounded by these attacks, 2 slightly and 3 more seriously. One of these casualties, shipfitter First Class Sharp of Battery No. 4, would later succumb to his wounds. 3 American engineers working on track maintenance in the vicinity of Battery No. 4 were killed during enemy bombardment on a single date, and Battery No. 4 also reported 5 additional soldiers killed and several others injured by artillery shells falling near road crossings. The Meuse Argonne offensive, the hour of the Woozlefinch. When General Pershing launched the Meuse Argonne offensive on September 26, 1918, the railway batteries were positioned to play a crucial strategic role. This operation, undertaken with the goal of breaking the deadlock on the Western Front and crushing German ability to sustain their armies in France, depended upon cutting German lateral communication lines. The critical objective was the main railway line running from Metz through Montmedy to Sedan. This line, running roughly parallel to the front, allowed the Germans to shift troops and supplies laterally between their sectors. A secondary route ran north through Luxembourg, but this line was longer, poorly maintained, and could not handle anywhere near the volume of traffic necessary to sustain German armies in the field. Captured German documents emphasized that this Metz-Montmedy-Sedan line was the artery that kept the entire German Western Army alive. If the Americans could cut this line, they would accomplish something strategically decisive. They would force the Germans either to surrender or attempt a catastrophic retreat, attempting to move all supplies through inferior northern rail lines. Battery Number 1 had been firing since mid-September, targeting the Laon rail yards. Through October 12th, when French forces began occupying the town, it fired 285 rounds, nearly the entire theoretical lifetime of approximately 300 rounds that military experts had estimated as the useful firing life of each barrel, considering cumulative erosion and copper fouling. Within just 2 weeks of active operations, Battery Number 1 had nearly exhausted its calculated useful life through sheer volume of combat fire. After standing down for a week, Battery Number 1 began an extraordinary movement. It traveled 186 miles eastward to Champenoux to join the assault on the German communications around Metz. Battery Number 1's crews were in the process of digging its recoil pit when news of the Armistice reached them. Batteries 3, 4, and 5, assigned to operations against the vital Metz-Montmedy Sedan line, arrived at Thierville early in October. On October 23rd, each fired a ranging round at Longuillon. This act had devastating strategic significance. The mere presence of these long-range guns put the Germans' most critical railway line under immediate threat. Recognizing this danger, the Germans responded with heavy artillery bombardment and repeated aerial attacks. October 29th saw all 3 batteries open fire simultaneously on Mangienne with 10 rounds each. October 30th brought Battery Number 4 to reinforce Battery Number 2 at Charny, where concentrated fire could be brought to bear against Montmedy. The firepower of a 1,000-pound shell. The 14-inch shell, weighing 1,400 pounds and carrying an enormous bursting charge, devastated everything it struck. When Battery Number 1 fired on the Laon rail yards, a single shell ripped up an entire 3-track railway line for a distance of more than 100 yards, tearing rails from their beds, shattering wooden ties, and excavating an enormous crater that made that section impassable. When a shell struck a moving German supply train on a siding, one boxcar was completely lifted from the tracks and thrown a distance of approximately 30 feet. Another projectile struck a German moving picture theater during a showing, killing 40 soldiers outright and severely mangling at least 60 others. 2 additional shells struck the same theater, completely demolishing it and destroying several surrounding buildings. The accuracy, once adjusted through aerial spotting, was extraordinary. When Battery Number 4 engaged the Montmedy rail tunnel at a range of 39,340 yards, nearly 22.4 miles, the longest recorded engagement of the campaign, firing 6 rounds at the target on October 30th, the gun demonstrated precision that seemed almost surgical for a weapon operating at such distance. The physics of such engagement were remarkable. It took approximately 90 seconds for each shell to reach its target, traveling in a soaring trajectory that peaked at an altitude of several miles before descending at a steep angle toward the distant target. According to technical analyses performed after the war, the pattern of shots from a 12-gun salvo at extreme range would have measured approximately 650 yards in range dispersion and 220 yards in deflection. By artillery standards, this represented extraordinary accuracy. Modern artillery and ballistic analysis indicated that the accuracy was superior to what had been predicted before operations began. The mean dispersion for one analyzed sequence was plus or minus 151 yards in range and plus or minus 51 yards in deflection at ranges exceeding 35,800 yards. Results that emerged despite considerable barrel erosion and copper fouling. Of the bore a testament to the quality of the gun's construction and the expertise of their operators. The strategic impact Admiral Plunkett visited the captured German positions in mid-October to assess the damage inflicted by the batteries. His observations, recorded in subsequent naval proceedings articles, provided detailed evidence of the gun's effectiveness. The shell craters formed by the 14-inch naval projectiles were instantly recognizable and utterly distinct from craters formed by other artillery. They were uniformly large, remarkably deep, and of extraordinary extent. Some craters still contained fragments from the shells themselves, allowing positive identification. The fragmentation of the shells was superb. No duds were found. All fuses functioned perfectly, and fragments were distributed with devastating efficiency. The general effect on German operations was catastrophic. The interruption of rail service, even though German repair crews would work through the night to restore communication, must have caused German commanders grave concern. During the holding phase before the French occupation of Laon and during the subsequent German retreat, the rail line was under constant threat. More significantly, traffic was disrupted for 6 to 10 hours each day after the actual bombardment had ceased, during which time locomotives and rolling stock sat idle, accumulating, unable to move cargo or troops. General Pershing, in his official report on the Meuse Argonne offensive, directly credited the large-caliber naval guns with achieving a crucial strategic victory. He wrote that the guns had advanced and were skillfully brought into position to fire upon the important lines at Montmédy, Longuyon, and Conflans. The strategical goal, which was our highest hope, was gained. We had cut the enemy's main line of communication, and nothing but surrender or an armistice could save his army from complete disaster. Fire until the end. The batteries maintained fire until the absolute final moments of the war. Battery number 4, conducting the last engagement against Montmédy, recorded its final shot as being fired at 10:57 and 30 seconds in the morning of November 11th, 1918. Accounting for the extraordinarily long flight time of a 14-inch shell at maximum range, that projectile landed just moments before the 11 a.m. armistice went into effect. Battery number 1 had already ceased fire days earlier after achieving its calculated useful lifetime. Batteries 3 and 5, repositioning their positions during the final chaotic days of the offensive, fired their last rounds minutes before the ceasefire. Between them, the 5 batteries fired a total of 841 rounds in anger during the brief span of their combat operations from mid-September through November 11th, 1918. Battery number 1 expended 275 rounds. Battery number 2 fired 126 rounds. Battery number 3 fired 236 rounds. Battery number 4 expended 122 rounds, and battery number 5 fired 112 rounds. Each battery had been allocated 300 rounds, and all remained within this ammunition budget despite their intensive operations. The legacy of the Woozlefinch. After the Armistice, the batteries were returned to St. Nazaire for shipment back to the United States. They began arriving home in December 1918 and were completely back by early 1919. However, the post-war military establishment, witnessing the rapid development of bomber aircraft and recognizing that mobile railway guns would be vulnerable to air attack, considered the railway batteries an obsolete concept. Most of the trains were scrapped in the years immediately following the war. One exception preserved itself for history. One gun car was transferred to Dahlgren Proving Ground for armor testing, using the massive naval gun to fire at various armor plates to determine penetration characteristics. This allowed the gun mount to survive long enough for the Naval History and Heritage Command to preserve it as a historical artifact. The gun car is now on display at the Washington Navy Yard in Washington, D.C., where it stands as a testament to American innovation during the Great War. The barrel currently mounted on the preserved gun car is not the original. It is a Mark II Mod 0, apparently installed after the original barrel wore out from the armor testing program. The fate of that original barrel, like so many components of these unique weapons, remains unknown, though it presumably ended up in the Navy's spare parts inventory after being reconditioned. The naval railway batteries represented something remarkable in American military history. A case where a unique operational need was met with rapid innovation, industrial mobilization, technical excellence, and personnel of extraordinary quality. They fought for only a matter of weeks, but in that brief span, they altered the strategic balance on the Western Front, contributed to cutting German communication lines at the moment it mattered most, and proved that American ingenuity could create answers to unprecedented military challenges. The Woozlefinch, whatever that mysterious name actually meant, had done its work and changed the course of the final weeks of the Great War.